told I talk in my sleep, but the results are embarrassing to those who listen to it. So hopefully we will avoid that. I have entitled this talk, "What do we need to know about Russia's war against Ukraine?" And I think it would be best if I divide that question into three others. First, what do we need to know about the past? What do we need to know about the present? And what do we need to know about the future, presuming we can know anything about the future at all? Let me just begin by making two general points. The first is that for both sides, this war is an existential conflict. So it was never realistic for anyone to suppose that it would be brief. Before it ends, it is likely to exhaust a good deal of the potential of both countries and their military systems. It has exhausted a lot already. The second general point, which leads me to the past, is that the widespread view in Russia, going back for some centuries now, is that Ukraine is an extension of the Russian homeland. Ukraine's independence has long been seen as an aberration, as something that is artificial, as something that is unnatural, and certainly as something that is anti-Russian. In the days when I was very welcome in St. Petersburg State University and gave lectures there, I was asked very sincerely by members of the faculty afterwards over drinks. They would say, "Your lecture is very interesting, etc., etc., but Ukraine's independence is just an elite project in Ukraine, isn't it? It has no real basis." I said, "No, I don't think that's right." And they tried to rephrase it, thinking, well, I'm an intelligent person, I must understand that. But in recent years, I would say going back to the late 1990s, even earlier, Ukraine's independence has been seen as a Western project. Originally adopted by the West, out of ignorance and naivety, but while Yeltsin was still in power in the latter half of the 1990s, the view of various Russian establishments hardened, and Western support for Ukraine began increasingly to be seen as anti-Russian in essence, in motive, and by nature. And that was then. And now things are much worse. So let me make three broad points about the past, which I would make in any academic lecture. I suppose there must be some of that here. And they would be the following. This war has three ultimate causes, all related to Russia's outlook. And Russia's state outlook, its view of the world, not just that of Vladimir Putin and his entourage and the elites he has specially groomed and selected, but of a much broader group of people, has three dimensions. The first, you would expect me to say this, is a geopolitical dimension. And that immediately creates a perception of affinity between Russians who think geopolitically and Westerners who think geopolitically, and a good many experts, analysts, academics have almost aggressively taken a very geopolitical view of this conflict, and they look at the world through these terms. But The Russian view of geopolitics in many respects is distinctively Russian and differs very much from our own. First, if you are the product of a Western military academy, you have probably been taught to look at threat as arising from a combination of capability and intention on the part of presumed opponents. The Russian military establishment does not look at threat in that way. It looks at threat in terms of space. Who occupies space, who is controlling space, and what interest does space serve. And therefore, the grammar of Russian thinking has always been about spheres of influence, buffer zones, client states, and so on. And it's been very hierarchical. Vital space is in no way defined by the sentiments or interests of people who happen to occupy it. It is defined by the imperatives of Russian security and geopolitics, whoever happens to be living in a particular space. And it has always been assumed that Russia has an entitlement to be dominant on its own periphery. And I could talk for an hour about why this is true, and there's a lot of reason behind it. Distorted as this, and often dangerous as this way of thinking is, but I won't. I'm just mentioning that as a bullet point. It's going to fail you, and it has. Right.
Continue.
I think the tape is going to win the battle with me.
Or without that.
So far. The problem is reinforced by the fact that historically, you see, if I talk about geopolitics in terms of controlling space, you say, a lot of people would say, with a considerable justice, well, in this sense, Russia is no different from other landed empires in Europe, Hohenzollern, Habsburg, and Ottoman, so on. But there is one significant difference in that, at least one, in that Russia historically has had very little experience of living with neighbors who are both friendly and independent. If you are independent, you are presumed to be hostile, or potentially hostile. If you are friendly, that means, in Putin's language, you have developed your own national interest and identity in cooperation and coordination with Russia. So, I will recall, I wasn't there, but a friend of mine was there. You will remember, many of you, the former NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner. And a friend of mine who was advising him accompanied him to Moscow in 1994 and 1995, just about the time Pavel Grachov was designated the first Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. And Grachov gave a little presentation. And this is during the so-called romantic period of the Yeltsin era. And there was a map. He put his hands on this map and he said, this is how we see the future security of Europe. And he swept over the entire former Soviet Union and said, this is ours. This is the area of Russia's natural dominance. And then he pointed at the countries of the traditionally made up NATO, that is to say, the countries west of the Neisse River in Europe, and said, this is yours. And the rest, embracing part of Estonia, Poland, all the other Central European states. We believe this needs to be a grey zone. Well, of course, this came as a shock to Manfred Werner. It came as a shock to anyone who heard this, because West was operating on the assumption that we are going to build the euro Poland free, that small states had rights, that the whole era of grey zones and spheres of influence was over. Absolutely not. So this is a perspective that recognizes only in the most decorative and polite sense the sovereignty of smaller states. Security is created by great powers and agreements between. And if they don't want to make suitable agreements, then we have rivalry, and then we have the potential for conflict and war. So much for the geopolitical aspect. But then there is also the civilizational aspect, which has been referred to in these terms from the 90s and now has a huge theology behind it, but it's always been there. If you talk about orthodox Western geopoliticians, they regard competition and rivalry and accommodation between states as if they were black boxes, and this term is used. You don't have to know what's going on inside any of these black boxes. States will calculate the options available to them on the basis of the imperatives of the system and the pressures bearing upon them. The Russian view of geopolitics is not like that. It incorporates the historical, cultural, religious, even what is described as not just the ethnic, but the genetic factor into the identity of states. And these are also extremely important geopolitically. One reason I have sat in lecture halls in Kiev where visiting Russian academicians have just told people flat out, it is not possible for you to enter the European Union or NATO. Not because we are going to stop it, but because you are an East Slavic people, and East Slavic people do not belong there, they belong here. It is not in your historical genetic constitution to be part of any of that. I was talking sometime in, I forget when, it would have been the late 1990s or very early in this century, to a man named Valery Litsky. The last day he had just been sacked as foreign minister of the so-called Moldovan Pridnestrovyan Republic, what most people in Western Europe call Transnistria. And he said to me, let's understand, Moldova will never be part of the European Union. I said, do you think Russia's perspective about this issue will never change? It's not about Russia. What is it about then? Moldova was never part of the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, its history does not allow it to become part of that. So when the Russians say, we have no quarrel with the historical West, they're not making it up. They're being very sincere. But by the historical West, they basically mean the states that in the past were part of the Holy Roman Empire with a few additions. Scandinavia, the United Kingdom, what we now call the United Kingdom. That's what they mean by the historical West. And any so-called expansion of this historical West is by definition an encroachment and aggressive. I re-emphasize these are very widely held views. NATO is viewed not just as a geopolitical entity, but as a military civilizational project, not simply to territorially restrict Russia, but to isolate Russia's whole model of governance and its value system and everything else. Where does this come from? I need to answer that because it makes a point which is central to what we are dealing with. These ideas are Tsarist in nature. They are not Soviet in nature. There is no greater misunderstanding than to say that Putin's aim has been to re-establish the former Soviet Union. His models, his thinking, they are all Tsarist. He has actually plagiarized sentences, paragraphs from advisors to Nikolai I, Alexander II. And he invokes all these Tsarist precedents, not Soviet precedents. When he said it was, oh God, when? Back in, I think, 2009, that the separation of Russia and Mala Russia, meaning Ukraine, is a crime. He didn't invoke any Soviet leader, not even his Czechist predecessor, Yuri Andropov. He invoked General Denikin, who, during what is mistakenly called the Russian Civil War, the war in Ukraine after 1917, led a white terror in Ukraine that was as horrific as the Red Terror, which was also being experienced there. So this also is, very deterministic. Russian imperialism is distinctive in a very particular sense. Historically, the Russians have always incorporated the history and identities of other people into their own. There was a rightly celebrated British historian, Sir Isaiah Berlin, who at one point in a book or in a lecture, he said it very often, he said, the interesting thing about most Russian writing is that it's all about Russia. But he was wrong. It was about Russia and all of those countries that it had historically acquired. But to a Russian, that's all about Russia. And that's what he meant. And he was someone who grew up in Riga. But that's what he meant. And the last point I will make about the past is that, well, no, it's not actually. Unfortunately, I have to disappoint you, but it's before making the last point, the penultimate point. The last major factor making up Russia's outlook is, of course, its own internal governance and the need to preserve it. In almost any period of history, certainly in the last 250 or 300 years, the internal system of governance in Russia has always existed in a state of tension with that of other states. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the most fundamental objective of Russian policy, certainly today, is to create the international conditions that are most conducive to preserving the internal conditions of governance at home in Russia. So there has always been, particularly in peripheral areas, and it's formulated in one way or another, a great difficulty, if not impossibility, in making a distinction between where domestic policy ends and foreign policy begins. Did these factors cause the war? No. But the war that has taken place would have been inconceivable without this heritage. But the war itself, like most wars, is not caused by ultimate causes. There are always ultimate causes and causes of tension and rivalry. They don't necessarily lead to war. The wars are almost always, and certainly in this case, the product of a mixture of pressure, opportunity, and urgency. And the pressure came from, of course, colored revolutions, particularly in Ukraine. But the most alarming development for the Russians, because it was not expected, were the protests, incredibly massive protests in Belarus in 2020. This was extremely alarming. The success of these efforts to not only change the regime, but the model of the state was always seen to have multiple implications and pose multiple threats for the survival of the state system, the internal governance in Russia itself. That's where much of the pressure came from. And when you factor into that this highly deterministic view that all of these things are being fostered and generated by the so-called collective West led by the United States, you can appreciate that for the Kremlin, I would say, beginning in 2020, the perception of threat was highly acute. You don't have to even go as late as that. Some of you will remember, I hope many of you will remember, what happened in Beslan in 2004. This slaughter in this North Caucasian town, and the massacre of school children and many others. When Putin spoke about it afterwards, he was very emotional. He didn't speak about Islamist fanatics. He said, we know who is really behind this. Those who refuse to accept to this day that Russia is a nuclear power second to none, that Russia is a great power, that Russia is here and Russia is there, and so on and so forth. So the sense of threat has always been there. This is not made up. That doesn't make it reasonable, but it's there. But then there is the second issue. If we have no alternative but war, which was the conclusion Russia was coming to when Volodymyr Zelensky defied all their extremely hopeful expectations that, of course, simply being a clown, as they described him, and having no experience of politics, he would be easy to manipulate. By the end of 2019, he was showing himself to be nimble, resourceful, and very irreverent. You can watch the video, if it's still posted, of the last of the so-called Normandy format summits over the Minsk Accords in December 2019, where Zelensky actually made fun of the Russian position. And Putin does what he's always done. I've seen it personally myself. When he's getting angry and uncomfortable, he started aggressively shuffling his papers, and he was not pleased at all. His advisor, Vyacheslav Surkov, in a side meeting actually at one point just picked up his papers and threw them at the Ukrainian delegation. He had a fit of the temper tantrum. So the old methods, which I have always called hard diplomacy and soft coercion, were no longer working. The logic of war became very, very strong by the end of 2020. But then there is the factor. Then there is the question. Will I be able to go to war? Will I be allowed to? What will this new president, Joseph Biden, who in his first speech at the State Department in February 2021, after being sworn in as president, said, America is back. We will no longer roll over. The whole year 2021 was devoted to exploring very carefully just what Biden meant, just how strong he was. And for many reasons, they came to two conclusions. First, these people are not capable of talking our language. They want to build a nice relationship based on nonsense, based on so-called common interests, which are devised in Washington, which have nothing to do with the points we put on the table about what has to change in the European security order. And that's the way they are, and we can't take them seriously. But on the other hand, they came to a conclusion which was easy to come to, which worried me profoundly, which is these people aren't really going to do anything. They don't have the mettle, and they don't have the competence. After the withdrawal from Afghanistan, both the Russians and the Chinese reevaluated very significantly their assessment of the competence of the national security establishment of the United States. So the threat was there, the pressure was there, and the opportunity was there. And that's why the war took place. Part one, I have to speak more, I have to be more concise now. The present. The danger in assessing the war today is that much of it is caused by ourselves, our tendency to overreact and overcorrect to what we see, particularly to what surprises us. And that makes it very difficult to have a clear perspective about what is possible, what is not, what the dynamics are, where things are going, where things are unlikely to go. Now, did any of you attend the Leonard Mary conference when Avril Haines, I think she's director of Central Intelligence, not the, keep forgetting whether she is head of the CIA or director of National Intelligence. She's one of the two. So you attended it when she was speaking, and you might remember the question I posed to her. I said, everyone is congratulating you here because the US intelligence establishment, and quite rightly, they not only predicted the war would take place, they got the date right, they understood where the forces would be, what the axes would be, that Zelensky personally would be targeted. But they completely misunderstood. They completely failed to predict what was going to happen. For other reasons which could form another lecture, but that's a separate subject. But the consequences of the routing of this offensive on Kiev produced excessively optimistic expectations on the part of Ukraine's Western supporters about what was possible and what was achievable. And these bursts of optimism returned after what was actually a very protracted and costly but victorious offensive in Kherson, and a much more blitz-like offensive in Kharkiv. And now we are where we are, and we are looking at a very demoralizing, extremely costly war of attrition, which has led everywhere to this microscopic preoccupation with Bakhmut in objective terms, not just in terms of population. A remarkably insignificant place, with all respect to those people who had lived normal lives there. And that has, of course, strengthened views that were always there, that Ukraine cannot win, Ukraine must negotiate, Ukraine must settle. So an exaggerated pessimism is now replacing the exaggerated optimism. how do we establish the coordinates of a realistic picture? Ukraine has two endemic strengths, in my view. First, it is a country that is very cohesive. And support for the war, for continuing the war, for not negotiating with Russia and not making peace with Russia, is at extraordinarily high levels. But that's a matter of necessity, because most Ukrainians believe that they would rather die fighting than die in a ditch or die in a torture chamber or die in a cellar. But morale in Ukraine or anywhere else, it is never inexhaustible. Do not underestimate how tired Ukraine's population is becoming and how weary. Very interesting fact, though. If you looked at Ukraine at any time since its independence was recognized in late 1991, early 1992, the further west you were, broadly speaking, the more hostile to Russia you were. The further to the east you were, the opposite. Even though, by the way, it was never the case in any oblast of Ukraine, with periodically the exception of Crimea, which was an autonomous republic. It was never the case that a majority ever formed that was either in favor of separatism from Ukraine joining Russia or joining Russia. The peak percentages were in the high 30s and some Rayoni districts, the low 40s. Now you see something well, first in 2014, this big discrepancy narrowed. It narrowed enormously after the events of 2014. Most people don't realize that most of the Ukrainian forces, as I say, forces fighting on the side of the Ukrainian state in Donbass in 2014 and 2015 were local people, and they were Russian speakers. Another unexplored chapter, which a lot of people just don't understand about Ukraine, what it is and how it works. But now we have something else. The further to the east you are, the more anti-Russian you tend to be, because the more you have experience of what Russian occupation actually means. So this morale factor is very important. The second factor, which gets far less mentioned, but is equally important, is that, and this goes back a long way, one thing that distinguishes Ukrainian and Russian political culture is that Ukraine's culture is bottom-up. Precisely because Ukraine is a new state, it has weak state institutions, they are not trusted, they are not respected, there is a strong civic impulse, people are used to relying on themselves. And even when the state effectively had a stroke in 2014, people started doing things. Volunteer battalions were set up, all kinds of things like this. Not possible in Russia. Russia just does not work like that. In Russia, it is very difficult to make a distinction between the state, the church, and the nation. In Ukraine, all these things are different. And I'm talking even about Ukrainian Orthodoxy, which is the dominant faith in Ukraine, but one of 5 major faiths in Ukraine. Ukrainian Orthodoxy is fundamentally different from Russian Orthodoxy. It's about Christianity. The only time I remember listening to senior members of the Orthodox Church talk about Christianity, in my experience in Russia and Ukraine, was in Ukraine, because when you talked to their opposite numbers in Russia, they were all talking about Russia, its greatness, the organic affinity between the church and the state in Russia, and so on and so forth. So this is a profound difference, and it has military implications because it is that difference that explains why throughout this war the Ukrainian armed forces have been much more adaptable than the Russian armed forces, because people query orders. Because when people don't have orders, they make decisions for themselves and they do things. It's not a black and white difference, but it's a big difference. What is happening, though, as this war takes its toll, as it destroys, as wars do in its early stages, first, the best trained and most elite forces, is that the gap between Russian and Ukrainian force quality has been narrowing. And it is also true that Russian commanders, that the Russian defense leadership have been learning things and adapting. And so these distinctions are not black and white anymore. And that needs to be understood as well. Now, I won't address questions that you might raise about weapon systems and whether the West is doing enough and all the rest of it. Please raise those questions. We'll talk about them later. I have my eye on the clock. So let me just, having mentioned where Ukraine is psychologically, let me say something about where Russia is at this point psychologically. Another enormous distortion that has enormous appeal and credibility to people, and which is promulgated by some very articulate and influential people in the United States, the UK, and other countries, is that Russia has become a fascist state. I'm sorry, it isn't. Fascism is not a synonym for repressive, autocratic, unscrupulous, or even evil. It's not a value-laden term. Fascism describes a particular political system. I'm sorry, but Russia doesn't have such a political system. It doesn't have the social ingredients for it. Russia is one of the most atomized countries in Europe. The social contract that existed between Putin and the Russian people was very simple. You let the state do what only the state can do. We, in turn, will leave you your own private space. There's actually been a lot of personal liberty in Russia for the average person during much of Putin's tenure in office. Economic liberty and personal liberty. Political liberty? No. Go out and protest and everything will go wrong. And it will go wrong in stages, which is almost worse than it going wrong at once. But if necessary, you could be pushed out of an 11-story window like everybody else. That's a very specific type of state and society. Yes, as well, there is quite deliberately this fostering of a mass psychosis. And it's real. It's been successful to a very large degree. Those people in Russia who get their news from television, and that means the entire generation of people who had experience of the Soviet Union, they swallow the vision of the state. I quote story after story after story of Russians telling their Ukrainian relations that what they're saying to them is simply Zelensky's propaganda and has nothing to do with reality. That all of these atrocities are being faked. That, and it goes on and on and on and on. Before getting to the last part, I have to add also because it's encouraging that there is a professional core of people in Russia. First of all, there is a large, very large group of people in Russia, we don't know how many, a considerable number, a very large minority, who are just keeping their heads down and saying as little as possible about any of this. I have a very close Russian friend, thankfully no longer living there, whose closest friends from Kazan at home revere Zelensky and play Ukrainian songs, sing Ukrainian songs at home amongst themselves. This is not astounding, but it's amongst trusted people. But at the elite level, there are also people who have enough experience, enough knowledge to know that all this mass psychosis has been created and that the mythologies of the Russian state don't conform to reality. So let me just read you, can't resist reading you, what two paragraphs from an обращение, an address given by something called the Russian Officers Collective under the leadership of a former general named Leonid Ivashov. I knew Leonid Ivashov in the 1990s. He doesn't like us. He doesn't like NATO. He is not a liberal. He is not a Democrat. But he is a patriot. He believes in a Russian state interest. And he's a well-informed person. And this is what this two paragraphs from this Всеруссское офицерское собрание of January 2022. External threats to Russia are certainly present, but they are not critical at the moment, directly threatening the existence of Russian statehood and its vital interests. On the whole, strategic stability is preserved. Nuclear weapons are under reliable control, NATO force groupings are not being built up, and there is no threatening activity. The main threat, they go on to say, is an internal threat originating from the model of the state, the quality of power, and the state of society. Therefore, the situation surrounding Ukraine is primarily artificial and self-serving. Naturally, for Ukraine to remain a friendly neighbor to Russia, it was necessary for the latter to demonstrate the attractiveness of the Russian state model and system of government. But the Russian Federation has not. Its model of development and foreign policy mechanism of international cooperation alienate almost all of its neighbors. Russia's acquisition of Crimea and Sevastopol and the international community's failure to recognize them clearly show the failure of Russia's foreign policy and the unattractiveness of its domestic one. Wow. You will find very little written in the West at that time which was as direct and forceful as that. These comments were delivered, they were published. To the best of my knowledge, nothing has happened to these officers, but they are thousands of miles away from any access to any button of power or influence. They're the sort of people I used to talk to when I went to Russia. Doesn't happen now. Anyway, they're there. If a cataclysm occurs, there will be people like that who also will be there. Now, as far as the future, there is, I've gone on for too long already. No, we started at, by my fast watch, 6:15. It's now 1 minute past 7. Please be skeptical of so much that is written about the fragility of the elite surrounding Putin, about the rivalries between people like Evgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the so-called private military company Wagner, and for that matter, Kadyrov in Chechnya, and their rivalry with Putin and their maneuverings to succeed in replacing him. I'm sorry, I see my colleague Igor Gritsky, who is not here, who knows the situation far better than I, also does not see his terms would be less gentle. Any wish for this to happen or any possibility for it to happen. These people wish to maximize their influence. The Russian system over which Putin presides is a predatory neo-feudal entity of overlapping baronial structures led by very capable people who would be at war with one another were it not for a strong monarch, and that has been the major factor keeping Putin in place. My own view is that unless and until a disaster strikes, unless and until the Russian army crumbles, troops in large numbers kill their officers, as they did in 1917, take their rifles and start walking home, until there is something cataclysmic that occurs inside the country. That's the way things are going to remain, and I will not predict how long that will be. And as long as there appears to be a war of attrition and Russia has not lost it and has not yet seen in sight of losing it, that also is going to keep Putin in being. And as long as a certain number of Western governments are determined to press the cause of negotiation with Russia, that is also going to prolong the life of the regime. One should be in no doubt about it. Things would have to get very, very bad for that to change. And it's not Prigozhin who's going to change them. I think it will be somebody else. And at a point of danger, then one could talk about the possibility of Putin being removed. And what we'll be looking at is Putin being removed. And it might be quick, but it won't be very nice. And what follows afterwards, again, is another chapter. If Russia emerges by its own definitions victorious, then it is not difficult at all predicting what the consequences will be. What do I mean by that? In 2014 or 2015, forgive me for quoting myself, I said the following. This was just after the war in Donbass started. Putin is determined to either control Ukraine or destroy it. Well, he shows no sign, Russia shows no sign of being able to control Ukraine or defeat Ukraine or occupy all of it. But they've destroyed a large part of it. They have destroyed much of its economy. They have taken its two prime export ports out of action completely. And if the war ends on that basis, if the war ends with Russia continuing to occupy territory roughly on the scale it occupies now, which, by the way, is not very much greater from, in the south it's greater from what it occupied in 2015. But it's not as great as people think. There will, first of all, there will be no realistic possibility of Ukraine's recovery. Even if you make the most heroic assumptions about the West's willingness to ignore all other economic pressures and economic realities and transfer trillions of dollars to Ukraine. It's not going to happen on that basis. Let's understand that. That's the first consequence of a Russian victory. We make one historical point about the Marshall Plan, because everyone loves to talk about a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. The total of Marshall Plan aid to Europe after 1947 was, depending on what estimate you look at, between about 3 and 11% of the then existing European combined economic output. What the Marshall Plan, which was very, very well targeted, did, it targeted what it provided necessary startup capital, it repaired essential things, but it underpinned the liberal middle classes of Europe and restored political confidence. And because political confidence existed, then private capital flowed in, domestic capital was regenerated, and it is private capital that revived Europe, not the Marshall Plan. If Ukraine is left in this unsustainable state, that will not happen. Ukraine will revert to a casino economy, and the only investment will come in will be similar to the investment we saw in the 1990s of speculators, predators, criminals, the rest of it. So that's first consequence. It will mean that Ukraine will become a kind of black hole. If Russia is conclusively defeated, on the other hand, the ingredients are there for Ukraine to become the most attractive emerging market in Europe. And you might mention corruption, but war burns through old institutions, and what we commonly call corruption, like a very strong fire burning through a forest. Tolerance of corruption now in Ukraine is absolutely at rock bottom. That's not going to be the impediment. But losing the war is going to be the impediment. And I will echo what Russian state intellectuals say. Compromise is now objectively impossible. It is ruled out. Compromise with the West is ruled out. That's number one. Number two, whatever costs Russia has to assume, the victory is a victory. Think about how many people Russia lost in the Battle of Berlin. Think about, the day after Stalingrad. Total up the destruction, infrastructure, lives, everything else in the former Soviet Union, in Russia and Ukraine. Vastly greater than anything we are looking at here. Russia went on to win the Second World War. And Europe, the rest of Europe didn't think, oh, well, they've absorbed these costs, they're not going to be a worry for us for another generation. No, they were worried then, and they had reason to be. And in Russia, the whole ethos of sacrifice, of paying costs, of what they call passionarnost, which is a belief that for a great cause it is necessary to pay a deep price. That this ability and willingness of Russia and Russian society to pay a deep price is Russia's core strength, and the West doesn't have it. The West is fundamentally weak because they don't have the ability to do that. That will make the victory seem all the greater. What will the consequences be here and in Poland? If Ukraine is abandoned, and of course if it's abandoned it will be done very, very elegantly, all the right language will be there, I think we could take it for granted that nobody is going to trust anything that Western leaders, that leaders of NATO countries say again to countries that are not in NATO, and even countries that are in NATO, including ourselves, if I may dare associate myself with you, will be very apprehensive about what the Washington Treaty means in these circumstances. If after years and years of reiterating, we are right behind you, we will support you as long as it takes, we effectively allow Russia to dictate with some cosmetic modifications its own terms, there will be profound consequences in Europe. Of that I have no doubt. And the final thing I will say is, the question I'll pose is, what conclusions will China draw? Very simple one. If the United States and its allies are unwilling and unable to see off their most immediate but less significant adversary, we have no reason to fear that they are going to be able and willing to stand up to us. So let me stop on that cheerful note, because now I'm at risk of speaking too long, and already I can see there is a question or a comment.
Thank you, sir, for absolutely outstanding lecture. But I have two questions about economy. You mentioned that Russian society has been pretty okay with being suffered, and if they would like to have a victory, then they really suffer. That mostly means a huge, enormous casualties amongst human lives. But if we look back to the history, even the 20th century, West has supported Russia almost 4 times. Even, let's say, during the Second World War, without economical support, it's questionable that the Soviet Union could survive even though they carried out enormous casualties. Why do you think if we are not talking Western economical support in this case, maybe China will take that role over, but how do you see that situation will develop?
In part, you answered your own question. Russia is not isolated. It's a big world out there. By the way, I believe, and I'm not going to quote people and sources, that even now China's military assistance to Russia is much greater than what you will read about in any newspaper. It goes through various circuitous routes. But, you know, by and large, the mood of what we now call the Global South is not supportive of the West. There are certainly ambivalences about all of this in some areas, but Russia as a global actor economically, I would say, is still very much a going concern. I am not saying the sanctions have been ineffective. The goals of the sanctions were misdefined at the beginning. Everyone was saying the United States, the goal of the sanctions, this goes back to 2014, is to change Russian behavior. No, it's not going to change Russian behavior. What the sanctions have been doing, but it's a gradual cumulative thing, is weakening the most high-tech and most capable and most essential sectors of the Russian economy, which are both defense and energy. But not to a degree where they can't cope. They are coping. Now, I am grateful for your question for one other reason, because you allow me to amend something that I said about sacrifice. Most Russians, ethnic Russians, are not making big sacrifices. The mobilization, the conscription is very carefully targeted at ethnically non-Russian regions and people. One reason Putin is apprehensive about further mobilizations, and he is there reaches a point where you have to start conscripting the children of these people who, by and large, have, with adjustments and inconveniences, been able to preserve their lives, normal lives during this war. Considerable number of people. There is, and you know, this is an opportunity for us, if I may say so, though Ukraine has to bear the brunt of it. It's what Soviet economists used to call the scissors crisis. one blade of the scissors is military effectiveness. Well, without more manpower and replenishment of manpower, they lose what diminishing military effectiveness they still have. Yet the other blade of the scissors, the other imperative, is maintaining social stability. So it's very much in our interest that these two blades close much more rapidly than they are. But this challenge is there, but it's not going to lead to disaster tomorrow. And I absolutely take your point about the contribution made by Allied Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union during the war. A little known fact, even before the UK was convinced that a German invasion of the home islands would no longer take place, and even before the United States entered the war, at the height of the Blitz, at the height of fighting Germany on its own, the UK devoted precious resources and set up Arctic convoys to support Stalin. I'm not saying this out of pride, I'm just saying, that's how desperate we were. I don't want to enter a discussion about whether if this aid had not been there, the Soviet Union would have had to capitulate, in part because I really don't have the answer to that question, and most real experts I know don't. But yes, that is a very important factor. But as I said now, Russia has other compensations to the West. So, comments? Yes. You're alone so far. Please, yes.
I have the second, much more smaller question concerning the economy. Can you explain the situation that we have seen during the war since last year, February, that we are kind of making heroes out of some weapon system that the West will contribute to the Ukraine. And main battle tanks became kind of piece of magic. Somebody's talking that they don't need 3 main battle tanks, 20, which is a ridiculous number to see the scale. On the other hand, in Kharkov, Ukraine had probably the biggest tank factory in Europe, with skillful workforce, with natural resources. Where is that factory? Where is the Ukrainian own defense industry? Why they are so dependent of the Western kind of donations?
Ukrainian defense industry is producing a great deal, and despite losing very important components, I mean, no one should forget that the Ukrainian branch of what was the integrated Soviet defense complex made up a considerable proportion of it. But the defense complex has been burdened by all sorts of pre-war problems, which, for want of a better word, corruption was probably the main one. But still producing a great deal, now producing a lot of innovative weapon systems as well. But with the quality and the quantities needed, by no means enough. Ukraine is very dependent on Western assistance. Now, you raised the question I was tempted to raise and didn't, which is about, this tendency, not just when this subject is concerned, but with all subjects, media-led tendency to look for silver bullets. Oh, if only Ukraine had F-16s, the Russians would be swept out of there. If only they had more Abrams tanks. So let me just express my own opinion about all of this. If the United States had supplied Ukraine in 2021 with what it was asking for at the time, I think Ukraine would be in a far better position today than it is, and it would have established a degree of momentum that even now would have encouraged a very high level of optimism. And that didn't happen, despite the fact there were those of us who believed very strongly that it needed to happen. But what Ukraine really needs to improve its force quality, at least as far as the weapons system, the two aspects to the force quality issue. The first is training. So many good servicemen in Ukraine have lost their lives or been wounded beyond repair that, increasingly, and the Russians, of course, have this problem at even greater degree. The better Russian formations are increasingly fighting hastily trained, largely unprepared Ukrainian troops, most unfortunately. So training is a very important part of force quality. But the weapons required are not the extremely sexy weapons you hear about. What Ukraine most needs is mobility. Yes, tanks provide mobility, but what is needed in greater numbers than tanks are infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and these things have to be provided in very, very great numbers because war goes through material very quickly. That's what Ukraine needs. They need, most of all, artillery shells and artillery barrels, because when the artillery is overused, the barrels break. They need air defense weapons. All of these nuts and bolts things, which a war at industrial scales just eats through very quickly. But here's the bigger problem. After the Cold War ended, all Western defense industries, including the US defense industry, were radically downsized. And all of the threat assessments postulated a need for small, high-tech, quick wars in the United States. The wonderful thing about these quick, high-tech wars is that there'd be no casualties. The West is no longer equipped to fight a war at industrial scales. When General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, says that, we are running the risk of depleting ourselves of weapon systems we will need, and he's thinking about China. He's not making this up. And if you just go to Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, say, here's the money, produce more of this and more of that, they can only do so much because the structure is not there to support it. The type of labor force required, trained engineers, technicians, they're not there to support it because the US educational system is no longer producing such people in the quantities needed. This is a colossal problem. Not being a real expert in this area, I only discovered it within the past few months, but a real expert would have known about it long before. And then add to it, if you go to Lockheed Martin and say, all right, what do you need for fundamental restructuring to be able in future to produce 3-4 times what you're producing now? They'd say, that is a relatively easy question to answer. But where is our guarantee that your demand will be there after we make this investment? Supposing this war ends in 2024-25, where does that leave us? Because you're talking about considerable investments that might put the solvency and the future of this corporation at risk. Where's the guarantee? Well, Biden is in no position to give a guarantee. So, I mean, we're up against it. Now, President Vladimir Putin has this view that he's always had, it's a very Russian view. Russia's resources are unlimited. Well, it's not true. Russian defense industry can produce everything required. This is manifestly not true. He doesn't necessarily know that because he doesn't get honest information. So the Russians are suffering from this to a considerable degree. They're now pressing T-54s, tanks that entered service in the late 1940s into service. By the way, not for use as tanks, but as stationary artillery to support well-dug-in troops. But that's what they are doing. So both sides are suffering from this. This is a war at industrial scales. It is the biggest war we have seen in Europe since the Second World War. And if you look at any future war with China, and my other China expert colleague is here, Ruth. Yes. Most people in the United States, if I'm not wrong, would say a future war with China is primarily going to be decided on the seas and in the air, and not going to be a war involving massive, prolonged employment of ground forces. So the needs are different between war in Europe and war in the Far East, unless my expert China colleagues contradict me. So, there's an objective problem here. If you ask me, do I really think the administration is doing, the US administration, is doing what it can do and what it should do? I would say no. It's a whole other issue. But they are doing a lot, but a lot of what they're being asked to do is simply unrealistic and not possible. The Ukrainian professionals who are part of the so-called Ramstein Forum, who are in day-to-day very close contact with the Pentagon, they feel that at least between those establishments they're talking a common language. There's a lot of trust there. But the Pentagon is responsible to civilian authority. I don't mean simply a civilian Secretary of Defense, I mean the White House, the National Security Council, and so on. That's where doubts, that's where lack of trust comes in, lack of confidence. So, yes, it's not either or. The administration has allowed itself, and much of the West has allowed itself, to have its levels of risk and its thresholds of operation effectively dictated by Russian threats and Russian intimidation about nuclear weapons, independent of any evidence that exists that any of these threats were carried out. For some reason, independent of any recognition that every red line drawn by Putin has been crossed without any of these dire consequences taking place. That's a major inhibiting factor. This psychological fear that they will do a mad thing. Never in the history of Russia, I stand to be corrected by anybody in this room or by any group I speak to, never in the history of Russia have the Russians challenged a power that they believed to be stronger than they were. And, I repeat, in 2022, they did not think the United States was going to be there, even at the level it is at now, but they did not regard the United States as a stronger power. And that's because they don't assess threat the way we do. I was having lunch in late 2014 with the top table, let's say the top table of a NATO intelligence service. in one country or another, and the person presiding over it said to me, James, what are you worried about? Our combined GDP is almost 20 times that of Russia's. And I said to him, wars are not decided by GDP ratios. They are decided by the ability to convert national attributes, moral as well as material, into usable power. That's what they do. Iran's GDP is probably 4% of ours. That's what they do. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor, their GDP was 1/7 that of the United States. So the Russians have a different measure of strength from our own. We don't seem to learn from it. Anyone? Yes, please, sir.
Please allow me a bit expand this theme and also the question from the gentleman. The tank factory in Kharkiv, you depended on the steel from Mariupol steel factory. This factory does not exist anymore.
Does not exist anymore.
Yeah. But I would also want to say that about the reasons why Russia attacked Ukraine, I think that the most important reason was for Ukrainian resources. There are of course coal and steel and coal and iron ore and other things, but there are also very important industrial objects. And there are about 5 such silent projects that Russia needs for future wars, for future expansion. These are Nikolaev naval factory. This is Yuzhma's missile factory. It is in Dnipropetrovsk, I think. It was the Mariupol steel factory, Kharkiv tank factory, and it is also motor seats. I think it is in Zaporozhye. It makes aviation engines and naval engines too.
Yes.
So I think it is very much the reason that Russia wanted this, and it is necessary for Russians for future military expansion. But now they have destroyed actually this Mariupol factory, one of these. But they may still get, they hope they may still get Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkiv.
Without disputing anything you say, let me add something to it. Russia has brought this need to seize Ukrainian resources by force of arms entirely on itself. Before 2014, we remind everyone here that in the country as a whole, no more than 1/4 of the population were in favor of joining NATO. A slight majority was in favor of joining the European Union. Leonid Kuchma pursued deliberately a so-called multi-vector policy. And there was every reason for the Ukrainian defense industrial complex to have, as there was for Ukraine itself, by the way, to have a mutually beneficial relationship with the Russian defense industrial complex and with Russia itself. The only reason this didn't materialize is that Russia, over many years, persuaded Ukrainians, more and more Ukrainians, that they posed a threat to the country's independence. There's no question about this. You know, Russia is, I remember, you know, back in the 90s having a discussion with the former Russian Prime Minister, Boris Fyodorov, and he was this great liberal champion who also believed that the Chechens had to be completely crushed and that this was just a police operation. But in any case, I said, you know, the problem I see with your whole approach, with the whole approach of Russia, is that you are always fighting against real security threats that you yourself have created by your own behavior. And this connection is somehow never made. If Russia just accepted that, yes, we have a related history with Ukraine, but Ukraine also has its own history. Yes, there are multiple and mixed identities, but there is such a thing as a Ukrainian identity, and it's legitimate. Yes, Ukraine is a country with whom we share some interest, but it also has interests of its own. Let us construct a relationship on that basis. Probably the relationship with Russia and Ukraine today would be its most important relationship. But it didn't, it never was viewed that way, and that's never the way it played itself out. So then, obviously, this logic of power intrudes into everything. And that's why your question is a sound question, only for that reason. And if you look at all the Russian commentary of generals, state officials, state experts going back many years, it gets worse, because looking at the same factors that you mentioned, what they take to be axiomatic is that the reason that the United States and Western Europe and the EU support Ukraine is they want to get their hands on all this stuff and keep it out of Russia's hands. And it's there in black and white. I mean, interview after interview. I participated in one meeting in NATO at the time Yushchenko was in power, and single-mindedly, obsessively, and rather stupidly pursuing a monofocal course towards NATO membership. And there was a meeting, an expert committee level meeting in NATO headquarters that I was participating in, about the implications of what, you know, of Ukraine eventually joining NATO, and we discussed the Black Sea Fleet. And everyone around that table, all the NATO officials, understood. NATO has no views about the Black Sea Fleet. Our only concern, we don't mind if the Black Sea Fleet remains in Crimea. The only thing we mind is that if it remains there without Ukraine's consent. What we hope will happen is that there will be what we call a status of forces agreement, which is a clear, open agreement, which is transparent, which is discussed, which is approved by the relevant bodies, executive bodies in parliament and everywhere else. That's our only concern. There isn't a single Russian I have ever talked to who is willing to believe that. Not a single one. It's axiomatic that if Ukraine joins NATO, we lose this, we lose that. The American 6th Fleet comes into Crimea and bases itself there. American missiles come to Kharkiv, and so on and so forth.
Russians do not want to buy something when, as they believe, they can own it.
A far greater cost to the economy than it would be if they wouldn't even have to buy it, just trade with it.
They don't want to trade when they can.
No, they don't.
And it is about Cessna too, because in Grozny it is the very best quality oil in all of the former Soviet Union. It's excellent oil, and so from Russian viewpoint, all these wars which Chechnya is not worth it because now Russia has that oil. About Sevastopol, here in Tallinn, I have a garage in
important.
how happy these people were here in Tallinn. They congratulated each other, they hugged each other, that sevastame nas, krõmnas
Which people in Tallinn are you talking about?
in Tallinn.
Which
Former Soviet military personnel
Former, yes.
who lived.
Of course they did. They were former Soviet military people.
Yes, and I can only imagine that in all over Russia, there are millions who felt that the same thing.
Of course they did.
We do something valuable, we are happy now.
But you know, there's another factor here. I don't dispute that at all. I mean, that stands to reason. This is what Soviet thinking was, in the military especially. Before Russia's war against Georgia, what was happening domestically? Putin's popularity was steadily dropping. Then after the war in Georgia, boom, went up. Then, one second, then before Crimea, it reached a very low level, and then bang. And we had what is still called the Crimean Consensus in Russia.
Yes, of course.
And then popularity has been dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping again before this war. And it was, but this time it hasn't quite worked out as it has previously, though it's been, you know,
Actually,
been mixed.
Putin does not need popularity very much.
He thinks he does.
But of course, it is not the current war in Ukraine. It is not because it is some fantasy of Putin. Putin is only fulfilling of the wills of very many Russians. The Russians want it. They want a conquest. And it is a bit parallel with 1914, beginning of the First World War. I have such an understanding that Russian emperor, maybe not very much personally willing to enter the war post the war, to call up for mobilization post the war with Germany. But there were some more wide environment in Russian elite who wanted it. So even the Emperor Nicholas II was only instrument of the will of the many Russians.
It was, you're describing an elite phenomenon, and, you know, there's a very long discussion as to whether the Tsar of Russia was an instrument of somebody else's will apart from his own. I wouldn't say so. You and I are welcome to disagree on that. I wouldn't say so. But the question is who he chose to listen to and who he did not choose to listen to.
Of course, it was also his choice. He chose so.
We must
Predicting
not
this.
dominate
Yes.
discussion. Yes, please.
Predicting the future, let's
What do you
say
mean?
that if Russia loses in Ukraine or is about to lose, that
Yes.
he is driven out, but the front collapses. Now, considering the correlation between Russian internal politics and foreign policy, could Russia, let's say, instigate another front or a war, let's say in Belarus, to give the appearance that at least in some place Russia has won if it will lose Ukraine?
If that possibility is open, I think they'd love to take it. But, you see, I can't see, there are two issues here. First, and I think I would be expressing the thoughts of Lukashenko himself. If Russia loses, the Lukashenko regime becomes completely unsustainable and the place turns upside down. This is why Lukashenko has abandoned his former policy of maneuver with the West, faces a very stark alternative. Either Russia wins the war or he's finished. That's all Lukashenko and his own elite care about. Themselves. at that point, having lost a war with Ukraine, Russia would not be able to stage just some kind of palace coup in Belarus and have the whole country fall into its lap. The country would be in a state of revolution and Russia would have to occupy it.
I meant military intervention.
Yeah. Well, I think in the context of losing a war in Ukraine, I find that rather difficult to envisage. If Russia wins, then Belarus simply becomes a new military district of the Russian Federation. That's all. It even ceases to have any kind of decorative independence at that point. Maybe it has a flag and a couple other things. We mustn't dominate discussion, and some of us have to go home. So, is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet who would like to? Yes.
I think maybe you have a danger of essentializing Russians with this last comment that whole of Russia, without any manufacturing of the will, has a will. I mean, there is historical Russian imperialism and so on, and huge support for it, but a leader who doesn't need popularity would not have a huge propaganda apparatus. They wouldn't send, if in the Russian spirit somehow there was this wish to sacrifice themselves for a bigger cause, they wouldn't send, as you mentioned, Buryats, ethnic minorities, people from far off regions, poor people, and avoid sending people from St. Petersburg or Moscow. So maybe if we essentialize them too much, then we kind of make a mythology out of them as if they're like resilient, always willing to sacrifice, just inherently want to occupy and so on, but there are more down-to-earth factors as well. If they, people in Moscow and St. Petersburg really feel that they are losing something, and feel, let's say, if India wouldn't buy that cheap oil from them, they would feel it closely.
But you see, it's my position, and I'm sorry if I haven't made it clear, that Putin's standing with the population is very important to him. It is a real factor. Nevertheless, it is very difficult for anyone to stick his head above the parapet, if that expression is understood, to visibly protest, to visibly go against the grain of the leaders of the country if they are seen to be winning. And that's why my view is that Russia would have to be manifestly on a path of catastrophic defeat for the stability that has survived up to now to be put into serious question. So I don't think, so you know, that is my position on this. It's very important to understand Russian society. Now, my colleague Igor is not here. He's written a paper for us, which is entitled or subtitled "The War." I think it's the last war of the Soviet generation. That's how he calls it. Because if you look at the younger generation in Russia, oh no, by no stretch of the imagination are they all liberals, and would they all subscribe to a Scandinavian or even just a Nordic consensus about the good life? Not at all. But there is a real spectrum of opinion amongst younger people, and who are very resourceful as far as getting access to alternative media, by the way. But the Soviet generation are very conservative, and by the way, they're not even properly Soviet because they were young at the time. They didn't live through it. They've heard things. They've watched all the old films. I had a lady here who used to, this Prachichnaya, she used to do my dry cleaning in Tallinn, Russian-speaking lady, who was delightful. But she would talk to me about how in the Soviet Union everybody was dancing, everyone was singing. I'm not making this up. She was very young, very little. She heard this from, she was watching films, and she was talking to me about fascists marching down the streets in Tallinn. I lived here for 5 years. I've not seen fascists strolling down the streets in Tallinn. But, you know, leave that aside. And she lives here. But of course she watches Russian television. We could carry on for a long time, but if you forgive me, my adrenaline levels are dropping, and I think it might be time for me to thank you and bid you farewell.
Few sentences about the Russian resilience. It is not at all so that they are wanting to sacrifice themselves.